In this video, I'm going to talk about 4 different methods of color that you might see when you're using graphic design and what they all mean, because it can be really confusing when you're printing stuff to figure out what these different color profiles mean and how to get things to match across different color profiles. So there's 4 main ones that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about CMYK, RGB, Pantone, and Hex or hexadecimal codes for color. These are all 4 different ways of establishing a color or communicating a color to another person, but they all have different types of information. So hexadecimal and RGB codes are actually the same informationally. They mean pretty much the same thing, and there's nothing different that you're really getting by giving someone an RGB code or a hexadecimal code. So let me show you a little bit of what that means. The way that RGB works is it's a mix of red, green, and blue. So you're telling the computer by using an RGB code how much red to use, how much green to use, and then how much blue to use. If you want to use more green in this color, for instance, you could change from 40 to 90, and as you can see, the color gets a little bit more green. Now this down here with a number sign in front of it, it's always going to be 6 letters or numbers, and that's your hexadecimal code. And this is basically just a cheat code to get you to this RGB number. So instead of knowing that you need 238 red, 42 green, and 123 blue, you can just type in EE2A7B, and that is correlated with 238 red, 42 green, 123 blue. You're often going to see either of these when it comes to a website or something that's being designed for a web, because RGB colors depend on light being pushed through the color from your screen. So you're going to use RGB or hexadecimal codes whenever you're doing anything on screen. If you're designing something for Pinterest or an Etsy listing photo or putting some text on your website, you're always going to use technically RGB colors, even if you might be using the hexadecimal code to represent that RGB color. So when you make brand colors, if you work with a branding designer, if you are a branding designer, you're often providing the list of colors as these different hex codes, and that's going to get your client to the RGB codes that they need for any of their web design. So what about the other 2 options, Pantone and CMYK? CMYK is also going to be listed here in Adobe Illustrator, which is the program that I use for graphic design as a wedding invitation designer. If you're interested in learning more about graphic design and becoming a wedding invitation designer, check out some of the resources I'll link in the description of this video. CMYK is like RGB in that it's telling you how much of different colors to use, but it's only used for printing. So if you think about, if you've ever used printer ink, you probably have seen it broken out into cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K stands for black. So you're saying this color is 0% cyan, 95% magenta. That makes sense. It's basically a magenta. It's kind of matching my dress right now, actually. 20% of Y, which is yellow, and then 0% of K. So if we wanted to add more blue to this, we could, for instance, add more blue. And since we have a lot of pink, and then we added a lot of blue, it naturally became purple. So whenever you give a CMYK code in the same way, whenever you give an RGB code, you're saying, this is how much cyan, this is how much magenta, this is how much yellow, and this is how much K. These are in percentages, so they go from 0 to 100, whereas RGB codes go from 0 to 255. So I do kind of want to show you what happens if you use the wrong one. So as I mentioned, RGB is for screens and CMYK is for printing. So if I were to export both of these as JPEGs, I'm just going to export artboard 1 and select CMYK, because that one says CMYK. And then I will export artboard 2, but I will choose RGB, and that's the one that says RGB. So it'll be really easy to tell which one we're using. So I've logged into my Etsy and gone into a listing as if I'm going to upload some new listing photos. And as you can see, both of these RGB and CMYK options look the exact same in the preview. They both look perfect. However, once I upload them onto my Etsy listing, you can see that the RGB one looks the way that we expect it to look because we are using the color code that is correct for screens, but the CMYK one looks a little bit crazy. It's kind of neon. They can change in a lot of different ways, but in general, just looks a little crazy. You can see the orange is like a little more accurate, but both the yellow and the pink have gone a little nuts. And that's because CMYK is just not a color space that works well for screens. And so while a program like Adobe Illustrator can handle it, a program like Etsy might not be able to handle it. If you work in Canva at all, which I absolutely love Canva as well as a design program, it is only going to be RGB graphics. So anything that you download is going to be a little different than if you had created those graphics natively in CMYK. So every time I'm saving something for print, this is very important as an invitation designer, I'm making sure that the document color mode is on CMYK color and that I'm saving it out as CMYK in my final PDFs. Now I mentioned there's a fourth color mode that you might use in printing, and that is Pantone. So you've probably seen these gorgeous Pantone decks. They're so fun to look at and play with all over the place. And what you'll see, I'm just gonna kind of zoom in on what that looks like. So you'll see on here that each color has a corresponding code. For instance, this is Pantone 2705U, and the U stands for uncoded. There's a lot of decks based on what you're printing on. So there's decks for fabric and upholstery. There's decks for uncoded papers. There's decks for coded papers. There's decks for a lot of different things. I usually use the uncoded deck as a stationery designer because that's what I'm typically printing on, is uncoded paper. But what you'll see beside it is you have these little formulas. So this one says Pantone Violet, and it has a number, and then Pantone Pro Blue, and it has a number. And then it tells you how to mix this color from Pantone certified inks. So if you gave this Pantone code, Pantone 2705U, to 1,000 different printers across the world, they would all mix this ink exactly the same way because they are using these ratios that are provided on each individual swatch. So Pantone colors are guaranteed to match basically 100% of the time, or be within like, just a percentage point of the exact color every single time. If everyone is mixing these colors, everyone is doing it the same way, everyone will get the exact same result. And that is the point of Pantone colors. However, the reason we don't use Pantone colors as often as CMYK, RGB, or hex codes is because they only work when you have the ability to mix your ink. So I can't go into my random printer over here and say, hey, we want you to use exactly whatever this says, 9.2 violet, and then Pro Blue 2.6, and then black 0.72, we want one ratio of that. So I don't get to do that with my printers. I just get to click print and hope that the CMYK codes match as well as they can. And then I need to adjust the file if it doesn't print. So Pantones are great when you have the ability to mix the ink. For instance, in letterpress printing, that's the most common use for stationery designers, UV printing or screen printing. All of those printing techniques allow you to kind of mix inks, and you're going to use Pantone certified inks, and therefore they're going to give you these exact ratios, and they're always going to come together in the same exact way. Adobe used to have Pantone decks that you could use in Illustrator, InDesign, all these other programs. In their color book section, you could find the different Pantone decks, and you could just click on whichever color you wanted, and it would tell you, Pantone 3623, like this one says AMPA 74.1, Ad Pro, etc. So you could always in your designs use a good approximation of that color. And then when it was time for your printer to mix the color or for you to mix the color, you would just find that color code and mix it exactly as you were told to. They have since removed that option for free. You can still pay for it as a subscription. But also what I typically do is just choose a color and try to match it as best as possible. So for instance, if we were going to try and represent this like purple color in a design for my client, I'm probably just going to use my color picker tool and get as close as possible. And then when you actually set up your files for print, for any of these techniques, screen printing, letterpress printing, etc., you actually set up your files to be 100% black because they have to set up the designs to run on the press a different way. I have a whole video on this if you're interested in letterpress and foil printing of how to set up those files. And then what happens is I just give them the Pantone code to match. So I send them the file with the design that I want in black. And then I would tell them, hey, this is Pantone 524U. It's supposed to be a light purple. And then they would be able to match that. Sometimes what I'll do is also send a composite file where I show it in the color so that they know, okay, this is what it's supposed to look like. You're supposed to have purple, orange, and yellow. And that way, if I accidentally send a typo when I'm sending over the codes, they have that extra reference to look at. One other way that people use Pantone codes is if you found this magenta color and you said it's close to Pantone, 1234U, then you could send it to your print shop. And even though it's a CMYK color and you're just flat digitally printing it, they're not mixing ink, you could say, we really want the final result to be close to Pantone 1234U. Then the printer can know to adjust the prints until they get close to that, because they're going to have that Pantone guide. They'll look up color 1234U and they will be able to match, adjust the file and adjust the print settings until it kind of matches that color. Not every print shop will do Pantone matching for you. Some of the larger print shops that we use, my favorite printer, Printable, that I talk about all the time here on my channel, doesn't do any of that because they're a very automated process and they don't have a lot of hands-on when it comes to their printing. And that makes them fast, reliable, and pretty cheap, but it does take away certain aspects like the ability to Pantone match. So you'll find that a little bit more with smaller kind of mom and pop or local print shops. And then if you're finding that your colors are not matching exactly what you want when you print, that's a very difficult thing to get through as a stationery designer. The best thing that I have found to do is print some samples. So you'd want to print basically a sample of 5 different versions of this pink, see which one is the closest to what you want. And then before you order the reprint, you just change this CMYK code to whatever you want. So if we found that the perfect pink when it was finally printed out had, 10% cyan and maybe 25% yellow instead of 20, then we could change this to a different color. And even though it looks different than we want on screen, we know from the sample that it's going to print the way that we want to on that printer. And in order to make that process a little bit easier, I created something called the Printable Palette. I'll link in the description for you. It's basically 33 pages, and then there's an update section with some more colors on it. It's over 2,000 color swatches that you can print. So if you're trying to match that magenta, for instance, maybe you print this page and you see which of the magentas is going to be the best for you. It just saves you a little time in having to run some of those sample prints. And I've actually got mine from my main printer on the same paper that I use for most of my invitations. I have it printed out and bound just like a Pantone book. It's so pretty to look at as well. So every time I'm trying to match a color, I already have a sample of it printed on the print shop that I use this machine and on the paper that I will be using for that same project. So instead of having to order a sample, I can just use the Printable Palette, choose the CMYK code that is closest to the color that I want to match, and then change my final document before I submit it to them to that same CMYK code. So this is just a helpful tool that can make color matching a little bit easier for you, specifically when it comes to digital printing. So just another quick run through. CMYK is for printing. Pantone is for printing when you have the ability to mix the ink. If you're an invitation designer, most commonly that's letterpress printing. And then RGB and hex codes are basically different ways of communicating the exact same thing. And both of these are going to be for anything that's going to be on a screen. So any social media graphics, website, Pinterest pins, etc. I hope this was helpful in breaking down the 4 different color modes that you might use in graphic design. Let me know what questions you have, and if you're interested in trying out the Printable Palette, it's going to help you so much with digital printing in matching CMYK codes from the screen to the actual paper, because that can be really tricky. So I'll link that in the description for you. And while you're here, I hope you'll watch some of our other graphic design and stationery tutorials. Thanks, everyone.